right, welcome everyone. Everyone here to talk about Xamarin, creating Xamarin apps with .NET. You guys hear me okay? I hear kind of a weird echo up here. I don't know if you guys hear that. Okay, I'll try to ignore it. It's very distracting. For how many people is this the first time at Dev Summit? Any? All right, welcome you guys. You guys having a good time? Yeah, it's a great conference. I really like it. It's if you've been to the UC in San Diego, this is a little more cozy, a little more manageable, and we're all among our people, right? We're all amongst our fellow developer nerds, so it's nice and focused. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. I'm Thad Tilton. I'm on the .NET team, and I'm a product engineer, so I mostly do documentation and samples, that kind of stuff. With me is Rich Zwap, who's also on the team. He's a developer and our most knowledgeable Xamarin guru. Do you have anything else to add, Rich? No, that's it. All right, Rich came out from...
I hate to use the word guru, but you know.
Oh, well, I can't think of anything that's, higher than that, so that's what I had to stick with. But yeah, Rich came out from Columbus, so he's enjoying the nicer weather, I think. So, yeah, I'm from Redlands. Okay. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, two broad sections. I'm going to take sort of the boring section at the beginning and give you some context. I'm going to talk about what Xamarin is, how it fits with the runtime, and just some basics on getting started, some resources that are available and whatnot. And then Rich is going to take it from there, and he's going to do a nice demo that covers a lot of tips and tricks and other things that you'll run into as you're developing your Xamarin apps. And so that'll be the interesting part of the presentation. So to use a cooking show analogy, I'm going to stand up here and give you all the ingredients and read through the recipe and tell you how delicious it's going to be when it turns out. And then Rich is going to fire up the oven and he's going to actually make something from it. So, all right. So let's start with a Xamarin overview. How many people have programmed with Xamarin before? Okay, how about runtime apps with Xamarin? All right, great. Quite a few of us. Okay, so what is Xamarin? Well, Xamarin is a suite of tools that you work with in .NET to make cross-platform apps, libraries for iOS and Android. So this all grew out of an open source project called Mono, you guys may have heard of. That's like from the early 2000s, right, Rich? It's been around for quite a while. So that evolved into Xamarin. Xamarin used to be a separate product that you had to install. Now it's incorporated with Visual Studio. So when you install Visual Studio, you have the ability to bring these tools in. The nice thing is you can work in Visual Studio on your Windows machine, like most of us are probably used to doing, but you can also use Visual Studio for Mac, which is a relatively new thing, a couple years now. And Rich is actually going to show you Visual Studio for Mac and some of the advantages perhaps it has when you're developing with Xamarin, especially if you're doing an iOS app, for example. So what can you do with Xamarin? Well, you can create cross-platform apps. So build .NET apps for iOS, Android, and Universal Windows platform. You get to write all your code with C#, which is probably the language you're most familiar with. You don't have to learn another language to write your iOS app or your Android app. You can use something called Xamarin Forms. So if you want to write actually shared UI for all of your apps, you can use Xamarin Forms flavor of XAML, and that UI gets rendered differently for every platform. Or you can still write platform-specific UI. So maybe you have a storyboard for an iOS app that you want to use in your Xamarin app. Maybe you want to use the Android AXML to create your UI and then use that. You still have the ability to use those native tools for your UI as well. So there's a lot of reasons you might want to use it. There's a great user community. There's a lot of forums and examples and discussions. It's easy to get up and running with rapid development, especially using forms to kind of prototype things on different platforms. All the platform capabilities are available in Xamarin. But really, to put it on a bumper sticker for you, or two bumper stickers, there's really two reasons that people work with Xamarin. So I want to use a familiar language, I want to use C# for all my development, and I want to use Visual Studio because I love programming in Visual Studio. I don't want to go out and learn Objective-C and get into Xcode or whatever. I want to do everything in C#. And then secondly, I want to take advantage of code sharing across all the platforms. And so Xamarin's great for those two things. There's two basic approaches for your Xamarin development that we'll look at here, and Rich will show you some of this. But so first of all, we basically have Xamarin Forms, and I mentioned that briefly for sharing UI code. You can create your UI using a Xamarin Forms sort of flavor of XAML, and then that gets rendered differently on each platform. So the great thing about that is you get to share more code. So now not only is your implementation logic shared, but so is your UI. Well, what's the drawback to that? I don't have quite as much control now. So maybe if I want to go native and use Xamarin Native, I don't have as much shared code because now I have to create the UI separately for each one of those platforms. But now obviously I have much more control, and I can make the UI look perfect on each platform as I see fit. I can use storyboards in my AXML for Android and my UWP, XAML, and all that stuff. So it makes your user experience a little bit truer to the platform, I'd say. So here's just a quick example. That is some Xamarin Forms XAML that defines a time picker. And you'll notice that same XAML gets rendered 3 different ways depending on what platform is showing it. So, and my favorite platform there on the right with the Windows Phone. So Windows, UWP, Android, and iOS. And of course, we'll talk more about that later. All right, so how does ArcGIS Runtime fit into Xamarin? We have APIs for native iOS, Android, and Xamarin Forms. Xamarin Forms supports iOS, Android, and UWP. All right, so the great thing about this is one common API surface for all those platforms. So basically, my ArcGIS Runtime code looks the same for any of those platforms. I don't have to worry about any differences there. And I'm going to apologize in advance because I know that anyone who's been to a runtime session in the last 5 years has seen this slide or something similar. But I just want to touch on it because it's really one of the cool things about the runtime and the way it's architected. So we have a team at Esri that just works on something called the Runtime Core. And so all the functionality that gets exposed to the runtime APIs happens here in the Runtime Core. So it's a set of C++ components that are built for, compiled for different architectures and different rendering APIs. And then finally, that's all exposed through the different runtime SDKs. So the cool thing about that is all the functionality is essentially the same down in core. It just gets exposed to these different APIs. So what that means, if you're writing a Xamarin Android application with runtime, you're actually hitting the same core that you would from Android, native using Android Studio and that API. It's the same core code underneath. And then, of course, with .NET, we have a little extra layer here because we also support a variety of APIs. We have APIs for Xamarin Android, Xamarin iOS, UWP, WPF, and then Xamarin Forms, which again covers those 3, Android, iOS, and UWP. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here before I hand it over to Rich is just some basic information for getting started. I know a lot of you have already programmed or worked with Xamarin, but I wanted to touch first on your development environment. So you're always using Visual Studio, and remember Xamarin now is just included in Visual Studio, but you have 2 different Visual Studios you could work with. You might be working in Mac, so Visual Studio for Mac, or you might be working in Windows. So this table just kind of compares some of the differences here. Notice if I'm on Mac, I can work with iOS, Android. Mac OS, there's a little asterisk there. We don't have runtime bindings in the .NET API for that, but if you're just using Xamarin and you want to use that, yeah, it's there. For Xamarin Forms, iOS, Android, UWP, of course you can't run your UWP app on Mac So that's not available. What I do if I'm in that situation, I want to create a Windows Form app. I'll start with my Visual Studio for Mac, and I'll test on iOS and Android, and I'll get the implementation code working, and I'll kind of test and tweak the UI for iOS and Android. When I need to get to the UWP part of it, I'll just move that over to my Windows machine, and I'll just kind of finish up over there and maybe tweak the UI for UWP or any other tweaks that I need to make. So usually not a big deal. On Windows, I could still create an iOS app, but I have to have a Mac build host. So you guys that have worked with Xamarin probably know about this. It's well documented, so I won't go into details, but essentially you need to go into Visual Studio and configure it so that Visual Studio is associated with a Mac machine that has Xcode on it, it has the Xamarin components in it. You need to set that up so that when you compile your iOS app in Visual Studio for Windows, it'll just go talk to the Mac host and make sure everything's kosher. Okay, so that's true for both Forms and for native iOS. Installing the runtime, the easiest way to get up and running with the runtime is just not to install it, to go to Visual Studio, to your package manager, and just grab the right NuGet package. So after you create your project in Visual Studio, go to the package manager. They're all hosted on NuGet.org, so just search for ArcGIS Runtime. Depending on what platform you're working on, Xamarin Android, grab the Android package, off you go. There is a V6 file or Visual Studio extension that you can download and install. That's going to give you those same NuGet packages locally if maybe you're developing in a disconnected environment and you just need to have those packages available. And it also gives you a set of templates that you can use in Visual Studio to get you up and running. Now that's only on the Windows Visual Studio. Okay. Some resources. The best place to start here is developers.arcgis.com. I'll show you some of this in a bit. I'll quickly just kind of give you a tour of some of these sites and some of these resources. But that's really your starting point. Developers.arcgis.com. You'll find downloads for all the installs, for all the different SDKs. We are going to ask you to sign up for ArcGIS for developers to access any of the download areas. But what you get by signing up is you get some space for hosting your own feature services, and you get some credits that you can use for development and testing. So maybe you want to hit some premium services and to test with. Well, you can do that from your ArcGIS for Developers account. Other stuff that's out there, samples, there's a toolkit, and there's some example apps. I'm not going to talk about them too much because Rich will show you some of that. But let me just close then by showing you some of those resources and how you can get started here. So this is the landing page for developers.arcgis.com. And at the top banner here, there's some kind of general information for runtime just kind of as a whole. So one of the things you'll find here under Get Started are what we call dev labs. And this is a nice way, they're kind of tutorials. They're really short, focused tutorials, 5 minutes to about 15 or 20 minutes. And they take on one little piece of functionality and get you up and running with not just creating your runtime app, but also preparing your data or anything else that's involved in getting your app going. So I'd recommend looking at that if you're new to the runtime. Notice here I am signed in, so I'm signed in as Thad, and I can go to my dashboard. And this is where I can look at a chart of my credit usage. I don't have any right now. I can access anything that I've created here in this space, so any apps that I've created. That has all my OAuth information as well, if I need to have authentication for my app. Different hosted feature services or web maps, web scenes, all that stuff is accessible through here, so it's kind of cool. Finally, notice at the bottom I have icons for every SDK. So here, if I click .NET, that gets me into the .NET specific stuff. The landing page has a link to download the SDK. The guide here will have high-level sort of conceptual information. There's code snippets and stuff here as well. API reference, to get some API reference. Notice that I don't have forms listed here. Why isn't Xamarin Forms listed? I only have 4 things here. The Xamarin Forms API is just folded into like the UWP, Android, and iOS. There's only some UI components in there anyway, so just don't be confused if you're looking for the Forms API reference. And then finally, sample code. This is a good place to start to see what's available, get some ideas of how different parts of the API work. You can download the code from GitHub if you like. So these are all live on GitHub, but if you just want to browse and see what's available, you can search through them here. And it's cool because you'll see all the code here as well. So you can just copy and paste that or do what you need with it. And notice I have switchers at the top to change between these different platforms, so I can actually see, what does the Forms XAML look like for that, and what does the code look like? Generally, the code's usually pretty much the same. Okay, so it's that point in the cooking show where I get to quit talking about the recipe and just hand it over to our master chef here and see what he comes up with.
All right. Thanks, Dad. You guys ready to cook? Yeah? Or I guess I'm the one that's supposed to cook. You guys just get to watch it. Cool. So, so what I want to kind of show you guys today, I'm going to go through the process of actually building out a lightweight little cross-platform iOS and Android traffic viewer application. And I want to kind of do that to give those of you who may not be very familiar with Xamarin an overview of what actually building these applications out is like. But I also want to highlight how you can leverage some of the resources that are out there for building up your application. And along the way, I'm going to try to point out a few little tips and tricks for those of you who may already be familiar with Xamarin and the whole Xamarin development process. Hopefully, you'll come away with something that you can use after this session. So here you can see we're in Visual Studio for Windows. I am on a Mac, you may have noticed. So for those of you unfamiliar, I am running Parallels on this Mac, and I'm running Windows as a virtual machine. And Visual Studio for Windows here is virtualized. It's running inside my virtual machine on my Mac. But it looks like just another program inside my Mac environment, right? And this is a pretty common developer setup. So here, if we look at what we have for our project, you'll see we have an Android application, an iOS application, and a shared project. So I'm developing this application as Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin Android native applications. So what that means, in my shared project, I have my business logic, but I don't have any UI there. My UI here in iOS is going to be in my view controller and my storyboard. Those are native iOS things. And in Android, it's going to be in my activity. And if we drill in here, it's in my layout file. So looking at what we actually have in the view model, we're starting out with just the bare application. So this is dead simple. I just have a map property. I'm initializing it with an ArcGIS Online base map. Super simple stuff. And then I'm consuming that base map in my view layer. So if we fire this up, I have iOS set as my startup project. You can see even though I'm running Visual Studio on the Windows side, it's smart enough to communicate with the Mac and pop open the iOS simulator and fire up the app and we can debug it, right? It's actually, it's really cool stuff that you can do that from a Windows machine. Now let's say we didn't like that light gray canvas base map. So we'll go with the world topographic map and fire that up again. And now while this is firing up, it's got to do a lot of stuff on the back end. There's a lot of stuff they've just made transparent to the end user. So it's actually communicating with the Mac build host. It's got to copy files back and forth, send messages back and forth. There's a whole bunch of stuff that it's doing right now under the covers to actually give developers this experience from Windows. The key thing there is that iOS applications have to be compiled on a Mac. That's a restriction that Apple has required. That's a requirement of theirs. So that means there has to be a Mac somewhere in the process. So there's a lot of communication here going on between Windows and a Mac. So now notice that it worked. We switched to base map, but that took how long? Maybe 30 seconds, something like that. So I just wanted to show you that real quickly, and that's going to conclude my Visual Studio on Windows demonstration. I'm going to jump over to a Mac here, and you'll see we have the same application, right? You know, Android, iOS, shared project. I've got a couple additional things brought in I'm going to use later, but I've just preloaded those to keep things smooth. But if we fire this up, we're going to see the same application, right? World topo base map. Nothing too fancy. Now the interesting thing, let's change this to our world streets coverage and fire this up. And now, since it doesn't have to cart things back and forth between two machines, you can see it starts up less than 10 seconds, you're debugging. So I wanted to show you guys this so that you know if you're doing iOS development and it's an option for you to do your development on a Mac, I highly recommend that because it's going to really speed up your inner development loop. You know, you're tweaking the code, then build, deploy, debug. It really speeds up that process. Over time, it's going to pay off. All right. So now I want to build up this app. I'm going to build a traffic viewer app, but first I want to just bring a little additional functionality to our UI. So one of the things we have that Thad mentioned is something we call a toolkit. So if I jump out here, this is basically an open source library of cross-platform UI components that are specific to mapping and helping you build out your ArcGIS runtime applications. So here I am on the GitHub page for our toolkit. And you can see we have this nice table on the home page that shows you all the different UI components that we have. To use these, you don't have to take the source code down and build it locally. You can do that. We also publish NuGet packages, so it's just a matter of referencing a NuGet package, and then you can bring these components into your application. So in my app, I want to make use of the compass and the scale line. So let's take a quick look at how we do that. On iOS, I'm actually going to use the UI designer. So this is my storyboard file. You can see I've already got my map there, right? So now the iOS designer does something a little funky if you drag and drop controls onto it. If you drop a control over another control on iOS, you may or may not know this, every UI view can have child views. So the designer thinks if you drop a control onto another control that it's supposed to be a child of the view you're dropping it on. We don't want that with the map view. So here's a little trick that I want to show you. So I'm going to select my map, go into my layout properties. Let me zoom in on this so you can actually see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to give it an X offset while I bring these other controls in. The map's just moved off to the side. It's still there, we just can't see it. So now we're fully integrated with the IDE. So if I've already referenced the NuGet package to just save a little bit of time. So if I type compass, we see ArcGIS Runtime Controls compass right there. So I can drag that onto my design surface, size it how I'd like. And I'm going to use iOS auto layout. So this is a system of being able to define how your layout is, how things are going to lay out in your application in a flexible way so that things will be consistent and laying out like you want across different form factors. So what I'm going to the question is this available also on the Windows side? It is also available on the Windows side. I will say that it works. Refreshes and such are a little more sluggish because it has to communicate with the Mac again, but it works. Okay, so I'm going to anchor this compass to the top and to the right side, and I'm also going to lock in the height, and I'm going to lock in the width, and it's changed to blue, so I know it has everything it needs to render properly. And then I want to also bring in a scale line. So that's our scale bar in the toolkit. It's called scale line. And I want to put this down towards the bottom. And I'm going to lock that, anchor that to the bottom, to the left side. Lock in the width. Oops. Lock in the height. And it's blue, so that means we're good to go. Now the last thing I need to do, I need to associate these. I need to let these know about my map view. I need to let the scale line know the map view it's showing the scale for, the compass, the map view it's showing the north direction for. So for that, I need to give these things a name so that I can make that association in code. You have to do that wire up in code on iOS. So I'm going to just call this my scale line, call this guy my compass. And save that, jump over to my view controller. So that's essentially like code behind on iOS. We were in the storyboard file. And these conventions, I mentioned I'm doing Xamarin native development. These conventions are the same for like a native iOS developer or a native Android developer. They would implement a view controller. They would use storyboard files for the UI definition. The difference here, of course, is I'm in Visual Studio and I'm using C#. So let's wire up my compass and my scale line, just pointing those to the map view. Give this a run. Things always take a little longer to compile and deploy when you're doing edits to the layout file. There's just more for it to update. Incremental builds take a little bit longer. So there you see we have a scale bar. We have our north arrow. If I rotate it, the compass updates and I can tap on it to set it back to north. Cool. Very little required of me as the developer to get that in there. We can do similar on Android. My layout here is the root element's actually a relative layout, which the design surface doesn't play well with. So I'm just going to bring these in XML. You can see I've already got my map view here. And then I'm just going to bring in the layout XML. So this is the same kind of layout XML you would use on native Android. So we have the full power of the platform, the underlying platform at our disposal here. And then again in code, this time in our activity, that's kind of the code behind on Android. I'm going to wire up my compass and my scale line to my map view. Run that. And with layout file changes on Android, it basically has to redeploy the entire application package. So it's just something to be aware of, especially as you go through and you're doing development. If you're doing native Android development, it can be faster to do a bunch of changes locally in your layout file and deploy them all at once. Iterating that can be kind of slow. So the question is, does the Android emulator run better on Mac versus Windows? Maybe slightly, but as long as you've got a Windows, I think the problem is with, there's a lot more variation in the hardware for Windows PCs than there is for MacBooks. As long as you've got a properly spec'd Windows PC and you've got your emulator configured to use a good amount of RAM, in my experience, the performance is really comparable across the two. So you see we've got our map, we've got the compass, we've got the scale line. same kind of experience. Now notice though, these map tiles are being kind of slow to load. Actually, these are being exceptionally slow. There might be a little bit of an issue there, but hopefully the network hasn't gone out. But I wanted to call your attention to, on Android, you can actually configure the HTTP stack that's used in the application. So here I'm pulling up the project properties. I'm going into Android build. And down here, you can see I've got HTTP client implementation, and it's set to managed. And that's also the same as what the default is. What that means is there's an HTTP stack that's implemented all in mono, in .NET code. There's no native Android stuff going on there for the HTTP stack. You also have the option out of the box to switch to the Android client handler, which is the native Android HTTP stack. So let's do that. Now, switching over to the native Android stack is going to give you a couple things. One is that just the processing of requests is faster. It's higher performance. Two, the Android client handler fully supports TLS 1.2, which is becoming an increasingly common security requirement. And Microsoft actually now is recommending that users use the Android native HTTP handler. However, there's actually a couple situations you could run into where that's not an option. The native Android HTTP handler, the biggest one, it doesn't handle IWA authentication. So if you have services that are secured with integrated Windows Auth, then that's actually not going to be an option with you unless you want to do some customization. In that case, you can use the managed handler. All right, so now that's come up, and we see as I zoom in, all the tiles are loading super fast. So that's another little tip for you as you go through your development. Okay, now I said this is going to be a traffic viewer app. There's not any traffic data yet. So for that, I want to use this ArcGIS World Traffic Service. So this is a premium service that provides us traffic flow and traffic incident data around the world. So I'm going to put that in my map. Of course, my map's declared in my view model, so I'm going to put this here. And this looks like a lot, but it's all actually pretty straightforward map initialization code. So let me jump over to my map view model, get rid of the previous map initialization I had. I'm just going to drop this in the constructor. You see, I mentioned it's a premium service, so that means it's a secure service, so we need to handle the authentication challenges. Then I'm just creating a traffic layer and a traffic incidence layer, creating the center and scale where I want to put the map. For this demo, I'm just going to put it in the Paris area. And then I'm actually creating the map with an ArcGIS Online base map, that viewpoint around Paris, and then those two traffic layers. And then finally actually pushing it into my view models map property so that my view layer can consume that. So I'm going to jump back over to iOS since that just fires up faster. We can take a look at what that looks like. Sure, yeah. Yep. And this is why we don't hard code the credentials right in here. So it's just a simple call. We have a global singleton object, Authentication Manager.current, and then you set the challenge handler to essentially whatever method you want to handle that challenge. So in there, we're calling generate credential async on our Authentication Manager singleton, passing it the service URI that the challenge has been raised for, and then in this case, we're doing username and password authentication, and then returning the generated credential back out of there. So here you can see we have our map, we have our traffic loaded, everything looks good. So we can see we have traffic flow on the polylines, we have traffic incident points. Now, one of the cool things about this service is that it's time aware. And it's not only time aware for previous days, you can actually see projected traffic data into the future. So I want to expose the ability to query the different time data to my end user. And for that, I'm actually going to go back to the toolkit. We have a time slider component. You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with time sliders from elsewhere in the ArcGIS stack. It's just a little control to allow a user to move back and forth in time and see how the data updates. So I'm going to jump back over to my storyboard, search for time slider. There it is. Drop that in here. Zoom in a little bit there. Make it a little shorter and a little wider.
Do you have code moving your map view back on when you run?
I do not. So the question was, do I have code moving my map view back onto the surface? I don't. That property I changed isn't part of the auto layout system. So even though it's respecting that in the design view, it's not going to affect how things are rendered at runtime if you're using iOS auto layout. All right, so I'm good with that. I'm going to set some constraints now. I'm going to hook my time slider to the top, to the left, and to the right. And I'm going to lock in the height. And then I need to, so my map is also hooked to the top of the page. I want to change that and make my map hooked to the bottom of the time slider now. So here, this is just a tree view of all the components in my layout. So I'm selecting the map view so I can change its properties. And then I can switch over to the layout tab and edit constraints. So I want to delete the one that's hooked to the top and add a new one, which I may need to bring it back in for. Yep. So I'm going to edit that offset property back to 0 to bring my map back. And then hook the top to the bottom of my time slider. It's gone blue, and I want to edit the value of that. Right now, it's hooked to the top of the time slider. You can see this 105 here, plus 105 pixels. But I don't want 105 pixels offset. I want that to be 0. I want it to be flush with the bottom of that time slider, the area I've set for the time slider to render in. So if we zoom back out, you'll see that's updated now to where it's flush with the bottom of the time slider. Okay, so we've got our time slider laid out. Now we want to initialize it. So this is similar to what we did with the compass and the scale line, but it's a little more involved with the time slider because there's more stuff it needs to know. Specifically, we're setting the range of time we want the time slider to show, the time we want currently shown, the time step interval, so the amount of time each tick along the slider is, and then we're setting the format for the labels that the time slider includes. Last but not least, we're saying when the slider's time extent changes, we're pushing that change into our map view. So let's give this a run. Uh-oh. Oh, I forgot to name the time slider in my storyboard. So we'll just jump over to the storyboard and select that guy. Give it a name, my time slider. So if you're familiar with XAML from WPF or UWP or even Silverlight, that name I'm specifying is like the XName property, right? That's how you can reference it in your code. All right, so see we've got our time slider there. And if I drag the thumb along there, we should see that update. Yep, there we go. So cool. And it looks like you wouldn't want to be on the road at that time either. All right, so that's good. But still we have a visualization of this data, but we want our user to be able to interrogate it, right? We see dots on a map, they want to tap on them and get information. So we want to add identify capabilities. So we've gotten several questions about how you can do that with the runtime in a way that's MVVM friendly. And the reason we get those questions is because the identify method is actually on the map view, so it's in the view layer. But the data you want to identify is typically is defined in your view model layer. So how do you marry those two things? There's a few different ways you can go about it, but one of them is exemplified in our open source apps. So Thad mentioned we have open source applications. So here's the page for that, and there's a whole bunch of them. There's several of them for .NET, but we put them out across all the different runtime platforms. So here is and these are all architected following MVVM. This one is for data collection, and naturally as part of that, it has identify capabilities built into it. So we can pop over to the source code and search for identify. And you see we find this identify controller. So that's a little helper object to help us wire up identify between our view and our view model layer. And we could dig in and see how this works exactly, but I just want to bring it in and use it. So here I'm going to bring in a folder that has two files, the identify controller, which I mentioned, and then just an event arguments. Okay, so now how are we going to wire this up? Well, we're going to, we want our view model to own and expose our identify controller. So we're going to have a property for that. So jump back over to the view model, put in an identify controller property, and then we want to initialize that. We want to tell the identify controller what layer we want identifier operations to run against. So here we're just setting the target of the identify controller to our traffic incidence layer. That's the points on the map, right? So then down on the view side of things, we need to also tell the identify controller which map view it's going to interact with. It's going to monitor for that user interaction to initialize the identify operations. And then lastly, the identify controller provides us an event to notify us when an identify operation has been completed, and it gives us the results back from that identify operation. And this, depending on what you might do, you might want it in the view if you want to hand stuff over to another view or update the UI somehow. You might want to respond to it in your view model layer if you want to do some subsequent things with the data. You want to do some processing of those results, or both, depending on what your use case is. In this case, we want to actually bring up and identify UI, so we're doing this in our view layer. Okay. Now, I could show a pop-up for this identify UI. That's kind of a common thing, but I want to do something a little fancier. In this case, I want to show a detail map, like an inset map of the area immediately around the incident that's been tapped on, and then I also want to show the attributes. So that's the sort of UI. It's you wouldn't want that in a pop-up, but it's the sort of thing that is simple enough that Xamarin Forms can handle that really well. Thad mentioned that you're limited a little bit by what you can do in Xamarin Forms, but there still is quite a bit you can do, and this is an example of where that's a great use case for Xamarin Forms. But hang on a second, I said I was doing Xamarin.iOS native and Xamarin Android native development, right? So all my UI to this point has been in storyboards and Android layout files, et cetera, et cetera. How can I use Xamarin Forms? Well, the really neat thing is you don't actually have to choose for an application. It's not just a Xamarin Forms application or a Xamarin native application. You can mix and match them. That's actually really powerful. So I can take this particular use case that's well suited to Forms and have something like this Xamarin Forms page here in my shared project. And you can see this is very simple, has my map view, has a list view that shows the attributes, and both my native iOS application and native Android application can reference this. So basically here, I just want to hand off the UI to that Xamarin Forms page. And I can do that just by, of course, newing up, instantiating that page. And then the key thing here is that Xamarin Forms provides you a hook to get a native UI component representation of that Xamarin Forms page. So once you have that back, in this case it's a view controller because we're dealing with iOS, you can just navigate to it or do whatever you would do with it on the native platform. So if we run this now, and I could do this on Android too, I'm just skipping over it for brevity's sake. I'm being a little long-winded, sorry guys. Wait for our traffic data to load, there it is. So now if we tap on one of those guys, it hands over to our Xamarin Forms page. You can see this looks, I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell as an end user that this is a Xamarin Forms page and the other one's a native iOS page. So it's just a really powerful thing that you can pick and choose within the same application as the use cases deem whichever one makes the most sense, native or shared Xamarin Forms UI. Okay. So now about this shared project. I mean, you guys are familiar with shared projects, I'm sure, yeah? So shared projects are really cool. I mean, they make it easy to share code between different applications within a solution. But if I want to take these components and I want another application to use them, or another 2 applications, or another 30 applications, it's kind of a pain. Then each of those solutions has to include that shared project and reference it, or bring in that same code somehow, right? It'd be nicer to have a library to share at least some of this stuff around. Well, that's where .Dotnet Standard comes in, right? So .Dotnet Standard is for building cross-platform binaries that can be used across iOS, Android, and Windows. So I'm going to bring in a little project. So this is a .Dotnet Standard library project. It doesn't have all of my shared logic in there. Some of that shared logic references very UI platform-specific stuff. But Xamarin Forms is not platform-specific, and it supports .NET Standard. So that identify results page that shows the identified features attributes can actually be built into a .NET library. So let's build this real quick. And that's built. And so I'm just jumping out to the output directory here. And you can see there's just one binary. And I could update my references, but I think you guys get the point. That one binary can be used by both my iOS and Android application. And oh, by the way, if I had a UWP implementation of this, it could be used by that too. And it could be shared around with any other projects that I might want to use that for. So that's pretty cool. All right. So that was a bunch of stuff. So just a quick recap. So we saw for your productivity, speeding up that inner dev loop. If you're doing iOS development and you can do it on a Mac, you probably should. Visual Studio for Mac is a little different than Windows, but it's not that much different. It's a really nice IDE once you get the hang of it. For the Android HTTP stack, you'll want to use Android Client Handler unless there's some gotcha that prevents you from doing so. We have a bunch of toolkit components. They allow you to add additional functionality easily. Just reference the NuGet package, bring in the components, do a little bit of configuration, and off you go. And then we have a number of open source apps, and each one of those has a ton of stuff in it. And they're a really good example of how you can build Xamarin and or .NET, Windows.NET applications. So go take a look at those, play with those, pull stuff out of them. I showed you a little bit about embedding Xamarin Forms and otherwise Xamarin native iOS and Android projects. kind of a powerful thing that you can do to help speed up your development. If you have particular applications components that make sense to do Xamarin Forms, you can do that. And then last but not least, .NET Standard's there for building cross-platform binaries and sharing them around. And with that, I'll hand back to Thad.
All right. Yeah. So we wanted to make sure we saved some time for questions, and then of course, as I mentioned, Rich and I will be in, and the rest of the team will be in the showcase area if you have anything else. But I wanted to just throw out a couple things here. Some other sessions that you might find of interest. There's another one that talks about cross-platform apps using things besides Xamarin, so Qt and Java, I think specifically, right? So that's tomorrow morning. If you're interested in that. I also wanted to point out that the two sessions listed at the bottom here aren't recorded. So I know a lot of people just think, well, I can just catch the recordings of something that I might find of interest and not worry about attending it. Well, those two specifically, you have to be there. So the road ahead, if you're interested in what's coming, what kind of things we're working on for runtime, that's a good one. And then the last one there, everything you wanted to know about the runtime. It's sort of a question and answer thing. It's really pretty cool. So there's a panel of people to answer your questions, and you can just throw them out there, and they'll answer them as best they can.
A panel of very powerful people within the runtime.
Yeah, the big wigs, like our bosses, essentially.
Yep.
And probably the same people that are at the Road Ahead session as well.
So that's one, if there are any particular things you really need to know about or you really want to advocate for, that's a great forum to do it.
Yeah. And I believe the results of that will be posted on GeoNet, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. They used to put it in a GitHub repo, but now you'll see that the questions and how they were answered. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that as well. And then I just wanted to ask you again, if you have any experiences you want to share, or any pain points, ways that we can improve the SDK, stop by the island. Like I said, I'm the doc samples guy, so anything you think is lacking for doc that might have been confusing or missing, except for you. I've heard enough out of you. So, and anything about the SDK, of course, we'd love to hear it. All right, I'm just going to leave this slide open just to remind you guys to take the survey, and we'll just take questions from now.
Oh, I actually want to add one thing I forgot to mention when I was showing the toolkit. So this is up here on GitHub. If you guys have particular features you want to see, or things in the existing components that aren't working or whatever, please post up on there. Engage with us about those features. That's it. I forgot to mention it earlier, but I wanted to put that out there.
Cool, thanks. So let me see, we've got about 8 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Share files in Visual Studio between the Mac and Windows?
The question is, can you share files between Visual Studio on Windows and Mac? Oh, you mean, okay, so you have them in one location, and then sometimes you interact with it on Windows, sometimes you interact with it on Mac. It doesn't work very well. That's actually back when maybe it works better now than it used to. My experience with that, going a couple years back plus, is that you could get into Visual Studio for Mac doing one thing and Visual Studio for Windows doing a slightly different thing. Also, you could get into white space issues if you have a source control system. Mac OS and Windows like to do different things with it. If you're talking about something like you have a project that a Xamarin Forms project, say, that has an iOS, Android, and UWP project, and you're only going to interact with the UWP project on Windows, obviously, and the others, you always use either Windows or Mac, then you can do that. But you can get into issues with having the source in the same location if you're editing the same files between those two environments.
Yeah, I often open up the same projects but in both environments, but they're usually pretty distinct. Like like your example, I want to work on the UWP side on Windows, and then I do everything else on the Mac. Yeah. Any other questions? How about?
So the question is, what's the issue with the table of contents and everything but WPF? So UWP, UWP, there was no tree view control. This actually just changed with the last release. So that's, Morton and I were talking about that earlier today. So we can actually move forward with a TOC on UWP. For the other platforms, you're generally talking about targeting mobile form factors. So the thinking is you wouldn't really, a full-blown TOC wouldn't be very usable in those environments. If you're on a tablet, depending on the form factor, it might be, but our thought is you might want something more like a layer list. That's just a flat list that you can toggle layers on and off. And that's something we're talking about doing. I don't know if that would be called table of contents or if that would be something different.
So,
Are you saying that's something you'd like to see even on iOS and Android? Okay, but so it doesn't necessarily need to be a full-blown TOC where you have legend and layer toggling integrated together and being able to drill down into sub-layers, that kind of thing. Yeah, okay, got it.
So
yeah, we agree that that makes sense to do.
Rich, I just wanted to ask. So, I mean, for the toolkit repo, they could go and submit issues, or they could vote on things that they
please
would like.
do.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, that's the best way to really ask for something in a really visible way that we have to respond to you.
All right, we have a question in the back there. So.
Xamarin Forms versus native, I mean, is there that much of a difference as far as like flexibility?
The question is Xamarin Forms versus native. Is there really that much a difference in terms of flexibility?
We went into using like, I would prefer to use Xamarin Forms because it's really one UI.
Right.
But I run into a lot of issues because of some advanced features.
The answer is yes, there's quite a bit of difference in terms of flexibility. If you just think about it in terms of what these things actually are. So if you're doing native Xamarin Android or native Xamarin iOS development, you have the same everything exposed to you that your iOS developer in Xcode and Objective-C and your Android developer in Android Studio and Java has. Everything there is available to you. You can customize the UI to the nth degree in the same way. And oftentimes on those platforms and Windows as well, the ways in which you would do that can be pretty different. With Xamarin Forms, it's an abstraction library, right? It's a UI abstraction library. It's built on top of those native libraries. So almost by definition, there has to be some degree of simplification. And then you're also introducing another layer of complexity where quirks can be introduced. So it's hard to say exactly where you would use Xamarin Forms and where you would use native. But in general, if you need something really, really super highly polished, it needs to perform at the top, and you want it to just feel like native iOS or native Android, native is probably the way you want to go. If you're willing to take what the UI library gives you with Xamarin Forms, if you're willing to say, well, okay, this is a little funky for iOS, or there's not that the same UI widget that there is on iOS in Xamarin Forms, those kinds of things, then it can be really beneficial. Or if you just have a simple use case like that attribute page. I mean, Xamarin Forms has everything you need for that. Mm-hmm. It really depends, but there can be quite a bit of difference. Kinda.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, I found that prototyping is really nice in Xamarin Forms. You got to get something up really quickly, and you can get the code working and not worry so much about the UI, and then circle back and see what you need to do with the UI later. Yeah. Any other questions? Or?
Are there any things in your view models that would affect whether you can share the view model between Forms or iOS or Android native?
The question is, are there any things in my view models that would affect whether you can share the view model between Forms, iOS, or Android native? Almost no. The problem is with that identify controller, it needs to know about the map view. That's a problem there because we have two map views. We have an Esri.ArcGIS Runtime.Xamarin.Forms.map view, and we have an Esri.ArcGIS Runtime.UI.Controls.map view. The second one, that's the native map view, and it's the same naming, et cetera, across iOS, Android, UWP, WPF. So as long as you're going across those, you're fine. If you're trying to use that identify controller in Xamarin Forms, you'd have to do a little tweaking. And you could actually get away with it. You could use some compiler conditionals to just switch on the namespace, and that would work. It's very close, in that particular example, it's very close to that. And it wouldn't take a lot to get there, but full disclosure, not quite.
Okay.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of activities in Android. Is there a parallel structure in iOS, and do you stick with forms kind of one-to-one?
The question is, if you're using activities in Android and kind of using those to navigate between them, is there an analogous structure in iOS that would be kind of a one-to-one in terms of screens? Yes, you're basically talking about view controllers. You'd create a new view controller on iOS, and you'd navigate to that, and that would give you a different screen. Is one way to do it anyway.
Anything else? All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Yep.
Enjoy the conference.